All right, so you're watching a continuation of the overview of Section 3 of the Special Report NAWAPA 21. Now, I wanted to address in particular the supporters of presidential candidate Ron Paul and his platform for bringing down the Federal Reserve and returning as the alternative to sound money. That is, that all money in circulation must be linked to gold and silver. Now, people are rightfully angry at the Federal Reserve as subduing the sovereignty of the United States and printing as much money as are the needs of the large private banks around the world to support the assets and merely fictitious assets of mortgage-backed securities and other government securities to build up this large global speculative bubble. And any central bank that can simply print as much money to continually buy a nation's debt is inherently a hyperinflationary situation. But be that as it may, that's not your only alternative. And simply stated, the Federal Reserve is not the national bank. Now, those who support Ron Paul have been misinformed by his outline of the real founding of the United States history. Now, on the other hand, those who support the hyperinflationary policies of Ben Bernanke and formerly Alan Greenspan, similarly who write in their essays on American history and the history of the first and second national banks, and who characterize these national banks as central banks, are also mistaken, if not liars. Now, what I'm going to tell you here is that the Federal Reserve is not the national bank. I'm going to outline this difference for you by going through the takedown of the second national bank and Jackson's role and the controllers of Jackson in that operation. But first, I want to refer back to the last overview video. The people who set up the first national bank, and even before that, the Bank of North America, working with Alexander Hamilton, were all of the key collaborators of Ben Franklin. And one particular individual stands out, James Wilson. James Wilson, who was the spokesman of the Bank of North America, was the person who drafted the Constitution. The first draft of the Constitution on the Committee for Detail was James Wilson. James Wilson was also the second most active person at the Constitutional Convention, the first being Gouverneur Morris. The two of them addressed the convention more than anybody else. James Wilson was considered the most intelligent person, most well-learned at the entire convention. Now he, as spokesman of the first bank, the Bank of North America, which was founded in 1781, was working closely with Ben Franklin, Gouverneur Morris, Robert Morris, and the whole grouping that led to the Constitutional Convention. Meeting every week, the Society for Political Inquiries leading up to the May Convention in 1787, and defending with Gouverneur Morris and Robert Morris the finances of the U.S. against British sabotage 1781, 1782, 1783. So it was this team, as we outlined in the last video, that led to the founding of the first national bank. It was not Hamilton coming in as some foreign agent usurping the United States, right? This is completely the contrary. And people who want to look at that last installment can see, outline the history. These were the patriots, and those who set up the first national bank knew what they were doing. And I outlined in that video how the first national bank worked and how this was key to establishing our sovereignty. And what James Wilson goes through in his defense in 1785 of the Bank of North America, of the constitutionality of this bank, and how it was actually the keystone for defending our sovereignty, he outlines that this was a bank that was hated by our enemies in Britain. It was loved and fostered by our friends, and that it was actually necessary not only to set up this uniform currency that it did, but that Britain could not subdue us by force, and what they did is they moved to subdue us by making sure that our finances failed. It was only by a success of organizing our finances that was going to secure our victory. And this bank had a key role in this. Robert Morris wrote the same, and Alexander Hamilton knew what he was doing. So we outlined that in the last video. Now I want to get into the takedown of the second national bank. Now, what we had is a situation where there was a whole faction, the Federalists, that began to actually be aligned with the Tories, wanted to be in a special relationship with Britain, free trade. And then those in the South, Jefferson and Madison, who, on the other hand, were also opposing the Hamilton agenda of the nationalist measures, the protectionist measures, the bank. What happened was it became clear after the War of 1812 that our real enemy was Britain, obviously. And there was a whole move leading up into this that was going to solidify the South with the North for this nationalist industrialist perspective. And that had to be stopped. But let's go back to where we begin with the Jackson takedown of the Second National Bank. It starts with Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton, and then years later proposed to the British ambassador that he would attempt to break America into two pieces. And the whole Southwest would set up this basically British allied state, and that would be his means of destroying the United States. Burr was caught in a military operation in the South, a coup, and he was moving down the river to Louisiana. He had gotten boats from Jackson, stayed at Jackson's house. Jackson was later called as a witness in this military exploit and was standing outside the trial house denouncing Jefferson, who was going after Burr, as a tyrant for this treatment of Burr. Now, Burr later fled to England, working and staying with Jeremy Bentham. This was organized by his aide, Swarthout. Now, he stayed there for about 5 years, 1807 to 1812, staying with Jeremy Bentham. Who's Bentham? Bentham was also a key intelligence operative, writing to everybody in the U.S. about how the Senate was just a terrible institution and how we should get rid of it, trying to break up the United States. He was key in working and staying at Prime Minister Shelburne's house, the person who had outlined the whole design of free trade to crush the colonies. And James Wilson writes the fact that we were flooded with cheap goods from Britain immediately after the military victory in Yorktown as a means to destroy the United States. And that was the idea after the peace treaty in 1783. This was why the design of the Constitution had key measures for regulation of trade, protective tariffs, etc. This was key for sovereignty. Now, we have this Burr, staying now in England, comes back just before the War of 1812 breaks out. He becomes a Wall Street banker, and he mentors Van Buren. Burr ends up elevating Jackson as the next key person to become president. Why? Because it's clear that, according to their standpoint, Monroe could not become president because Monroe was being supported by the South. And Monroe's policies, the tariff protectionist measures, the railroad, this was supported also by people in the South, mainly Calhoun, who supported the bank. So the configuration of the South and the North was coming together, which had been an unstoppable United States, according to the views of the British. So Burr writes to his son-in-law, former governor of South Carolina, 1815, on November 20th, to try to stop Monroe, saying, there's somebody else we have to elevate. Quote, the man is Andrew Jackson. And he says, you have to be seen as the prominent key player in promoting him. It's key that your work, unquote, is seen. So Jackson is being promoted by Aaron Burr, right? Now, Aaron Burr's aide, Swarthout, who had arranged for him to stay at Bentham's house, also returned in 1812 and became none other than Jackson's political aide. Okay, 1823, Burr's New York understudy, Van Buren, now organizes a new Democratic Party, which is based on aligning the plantation owners with the New York financiers, and explicitly is to make plantation slavery the key platform, the key pivot of the party. So Jackson comes out. Obviously, Monroe is in there for two administrations, but then John Quincy Adams wins the 1824 election. But this Jackson operation is well underway and has been underway explicitly since 1815. 1824, Clay comes in with the tariff law. John Quincy Adams pushes the internal improvements, which Monroe had signed an act for just before leaving president. U.S. Army engineers are brought in for internal improvements. We see a skyrocketing of actual sovereignty of the United States. Finally, with this protectionist tariff law, the iron begins to increase 100% between 1821 and 1824, 1824 to 1827, 50% increase. We start to get real sovereignty with iron. Coal production goes from zero, now with the protective tariff, up to millions in the next 2 decades. We see with the National Bank a collaboration between these internal improvement measures of John Quincy Adams, all the canals and rails, and the financing through the National Bank. Nicholas Biddle at the National Bank, who was appointed earlier by Monroe, is promoting and investing in all of these long-term infrastructure projects and national enterprises. Matthew Carey, who set up the Society for Manufacturers in Pennsylvania, Ben Franklin's key collaborator also in the Revolutionary War, he's working with Nicholas Biddle in promoting all of this investment with the National Bank. So again, it's the patriot movement. It's the people in the United States who are moving against the British, against the Tories, for national sovereignty, who are behind this. So this grouping is pushing this policy, and they're also looking at the fact that the National Bank is lending, in association with the United States government, investing its credit, essentially, with the expectation that these national industries are going to succeed with the protective tariff. So it's ensuring the investment. It's ensuring that the debt that's created is going to be actualized, because we're ensuring also the success of the industries and national enterprises of the country. And this is Hamilton's maxim again, that the creation of a debt is always created as tied to channeling the resources of the federal government to ensure its eventual extinguishment. There's no self-evident debt that's ever sitting there that's just has to be funded or extinguished by cutting something, paying something off. The debt is itself the future creation of progress, future creation of industry, a project, some kind of expected revenue back to the federal government, or in this case, the funding of the National Bank, and the interest made in investing all the projects. So we have this period where John Quincy Adams is president for 4 years, but even before that, because of the National Bank in 1816, the rechartering of it, we have this whole period of moving forward with the canals and the railroads. Jackson is led out of the gate, right? Van Buren, his controllers, say, you got to attack Clay and John Quincy Adams as these, they're working together against the real population of the United States, now especially the Southerner plantation owners. In 1828, Jackson wins the presidency, and he's put forward as the people's man, and he wins. Van Buren is drumming him up for this whole administration that his real enemies are at the National Bank, and they're financing they're financing his opponents and so on. So the whole re-election campaign of 1832 is about the bank, the evils of the bank, but not going and attacking any of these individuals by name, who are all known to be appointed individuals by the president. 5 of the 25 directors of the bank are appointed by the president and the Senate. The bank directors themselves are always up for election. These are people who are well known, respected. There would be no chance in heck that anybody would believe Jackson or Secretary of Treasury Tawney to go and attack these individuals by name. This was obvious to Clay and the Congress that Jackson was going to do something during his campaign, so during his next administration. So what they did is they said, let's put the rechartering of the bank, although the charter didn't end up in 1836, let's put this up now to preempt Jackson. And Jackson vetoed this, even though it was passed by Congress. Jackson vetoes this, and then he removes the deposits of the National Bank. I'm going to go through this now because this outlines the pure executive usurpation of Jackson, the tyranny of this action that destroyed what was the institution that made all of the canals, rail building, industrial progress possible. The institution that created a more sound currency than ever, made the banknotes in circulation more valuable than gold and silver. And it was an institution that was based on the legacy all the way from Ben Franklin, James Wilson, Gouverneur Morris, Robert Morris, Hamilton, this whole legacy of patriots. The only way that this institution could be killed was none other than by tyranny, pure executive diktat. There was no legislative process that ever brought down this bank. In fact, how it worked was Jackson, during the recess, before Congress came back, told his Secretary of the Treasury to remove the public deposits of the National Bank. He refused. Jackson appointed a second Secretary of Treasury and told him remove the deposits from the National Bank, and he refused. So then he put in a third, Taney, and we'll go through what a crook this guy was, who then went ahead and did the order during recess. For what purpose? We'll get into why he did that. Now, what happens is this. Through this process, after the removal of the deposits, I'll fast forward the fact that Jackson's whole plan was to destroy this industrial powerhouse of the United States. We just outlined who he was, as who he was according to the asset of the British with Aaron Burr and Jeremy Bentham and so forth. What he did was to ensure that there would be no more internal improvements, no more protectionist measures, an attack against that legacy, and make sure that the United States would not be what it was going to be, which was the end of the British Empire, even then. Now, drumming up the population, people are going for this, and we saw this happen, a collapse of the bank, a collapse of all these things, but the Senate censured Jackson. And that was the first time in American history that we had a president who was censured, which is one step down of impeachment for this action. That's not a light attack against the president for this action. There was no huge majority that Jackson wanted to say for this takedown of the bank. It was 50-50. The people who voted on it got reelected. The people who voted against it got reelected. There was no massive election switch because of the people who supported the National Bank. Now, Van Buren in 1837 then became president. The whole banking system contracted by about 50% or even more because credit was gone. The intention of the Jackson crowd was to get rid of all banknotes as means of payment of government. Everything had to be done in gold and silver. And Lincoln himself later ends up attacking this measure, who was a big supporter of the National Bank, protective tariffs, and internal improvements. So, after that, what happens? August Belmont, who's a Rothschild banker trainee in Europe, comes over. You have the British and Austrian banks, the Rothschild banks. He comes over from Britain, and in 1836, he is basically directing Van Buren's Democratic Party, and he directs the Rothschild banking interests in buying up property in what is now a U.S. in crisis, a devaluation of a lot of things. So these get bought up now. The banking system has clenched up. The big bank panic in 1837 leads to the beginning of a contraction of the U.S. economy as a whole. So this is what happened. Now let's review what Jackson did. So we have the removal of the public deposits, which was not legal according to the bank charter of 1816. If it was going to be done, it had to be done once the deposits were in the bank as a place where they had safekeeping. The bank would lend on the basis of this increased deposit of all government taxes, all government revenues. The Treasury could bring money out of there for appropriation for payments, but not move all the deposits out of the bank, according to the charter, according to the time in which this bank had a charter from Congress. Otherwise, Congress would have to pass a law. There would have to be some legal change in order for that to have been appropriate. And what the the Ways and Means Committee did in 1832 was to cite a slew of precedents, so-called, for what Taney did. John Quincy Adams shows that all of these precedents were not actual precedents, and they did not involve the kind of action that Taney did. And he goes through that in detail in a speech that he meant to give in 1834 on the removal of the deposits. But the Speaker of the House did not allow him to give this. And although he'd been president 6 years earlier, he was passed over. Somebody else called on after 3 weeks of being ignored. He ended up publishing his speech as a pamphlet. So I'm citing this speech now, and you can find this online and look at the kind of the kind of detail that John Quincy Adams goes through in this whole operation. What they did, they take the money out of the national bank. They loan the money to favored banks at 0% interest. The bank is now loaning, these state banks are then loaning money at the government for interest. And what we had then was this transferring of the public funds to a place that had been profitable, because 1/5 of the capital of the national bank was the U.S. public deposits. Every profit made through investments in canals, businesses, etc., was a profit to the country. In the state banks, this was not the case. So we moved, what Taney did was to move the public deposits, move the public funds from the Bank of the U.S. that was profitable to the people to the Union Bank of Baltimore, where it was profitable to himself, him being a stockholder, a shareholder in the bank. And then other banks, other friends of Jackson, who would also now make large amounts of money in these state banks with the fact that there'd be a large amount of this public funds sitting in these banks. Now these public funds could be used for all the speculative purposes, gambling purposes that was done. What the Secretary of Treasury did was to give a list of reasons of why he did this, and John Quincy Adams goes through the list of reasons. And one thing he points out that one list of reasons was that now that we were approaching the time of the recharter. But he would not have had to use this reason that we're approaching the time of the recharter of the bank, that therefore he just moved all the deposits, public deposits out, if it was indeed that there was actually some dishonesty and basically abuse of the public funds in the Second National Bank, which was the whole campaign. The bank is evil, it's taking your money. Well, if that was the case, why give such a measly reason of the fact that just the charter of the bank is ending out? And that was the reason Taney gave, because they couldn't prove that there was any abuse of the public funds at the National Bank. If there was, they could have actually had a trial on this or investigated it. So instead of a national bank that had a charter with Congress, that had all kinds of regulations with the government of the United States, it's an entity created by the United States. It's an entity that's designed to be a benefit to the revenues of the United States, a profit to the government, and to facilitate an increase of taxes all over the country through investment, and to supply the needs of the population. Now we have state banks, no contracts, no contracts through Congress. There is no design by Congress of how this money is going to be used. It's merely a contract between the Secretary of Treasury and his political friends at the banks, some of which, as in the Union Bank of Baltimore, he's a shareholder, he's making money. And these were now banks, much more limited circulation. Rival banks with these state banks, 20 different states. How is this going to be coordinated more effectively than this bank, this evil bank, right? There was nothing proved of what this national bank was actually doing that was supposedly the benefit of Taney doing this, as I said. But this is also a violation of a law that was put forward in 1820 of what the Secretary of Treasury had to do if he was going to make a contract with any bank. And there's a whole measure that John Quincy Adams outlines that he violated in even trying to make such a contract with these banks. He was prohibited from doing that. What happens if these banks would actually break the contract? John Quincy Adams poses. And they suspend specie payment, which is gold and silver. Now where are your deposits? All you're going to get for this is a consolation for what is a disgrace of violated public faith. Now, as I said before, these banks were leveraged, and people want to say that fractional reserve banking, the banks are making all this money by lending on the money of the people and leveraging this a million times. Now, that is being done by the Federal Reserve, but the Bank of the United States did not do that. And John Quincy Adams points out that the Bank of the United States, its leveraging was less than 2 to 1. These state banks were 7 to 1. During Lincoln's period, these state banks were involved in all kind of fraud. And there's 1,000 different currencies. Banks are creating money out of thin air, which, yes, the Federal Reserve is doing now. But that's not what the Second National Bank did, nor the First National Bank. And again, the Federal Reserve is not the national bank. Now, the bank did nothing wrong, and if it did, the Attorney General should have came forward and put these people on trial, as this was. These were individuals who had rights. The bank had rights according to Congress's charter, so forth. Where was the trial? Instead, Jackson and Tawney, the Secretary of Treasury, accused and judged themselves. They were the accusers, the judge, the jury, and the executioner of the bank. They drew the charge, pronounced the sentence of guilt, judged that there was no rights to be had by this bank, forfeited the rights for a trial, and then executed that judgment. All by this removal of the deposits without hearing the parties accused, without giving them notice of charges against the bank. So it was all done by diktat. And if there had been reasons, they would have taken the right measures to do it. They did it during the recess because there was no way that Congress would have allowed this to happen under a valid trial. What the attack was that, this bank is seeing its own interests as its foremost objective. Abraham Lincoln cites the fact that that's the best thing about the bank, is that it doesn't have the interest of just running off with the people's money, because the public and private credit are united. Whatever the bank makes in profit through loans, the public, which has 1/5 of the deposits, is making a profit on that. And that's the whole design of the bank, was that you have people who are interested in making a profit with the people's money rather than running off with it, which is exactly what Tawney did. And the state banks sitting around then gambling with the people's money with no safety measures set in, and all for the purposes of the profits of these state banks, which don't now, the United States is not going to make profit off of all of that. So he points out that this was actually the chief virtue, and so this reasoning by Tawney was a little bit ridiculous, to say the least. But here's another thing. They're charged with all kinds of fraud and using the people's money unwisely. The big thing was that they were publishing pamphlets during the 1832 election to educate people in the bank for the total sum of $60,000. And they said, oh, you put all the people's money at stake. Well, they only printed enough pamphlets that cost $60,000 to educate the public, versus Jackson's attack on the Second National Bank during his 1832 election collapsed the shares of the bank such that it cost the population $1.7 million. Secretary of Treasury Duane, who was the first one who was in there, and then pulled out, and then McLean is put in Secretary of Treasury, pulled out because they wouldn't go along with this objective, says that Jackson had intended to remove the deposits long before, but planned to do it during this recess so that when Congress came in, they could be shown that we don't need a national bank. We've got all of our money now in the state banks. And this was the objective because he knew that Congress wouldn't go along with it. And what Jackson told the Secretary of Treasury is, quote, it would be idle to rely on the legislature or the judiciary because their inclinations were already known. They wouldn't have gone along with it. So he decided to be the legislator and the judge all himself. So it was the executive will was substituted instead of this actual process. And John Quincy Adams poses to his members of the Congress, now the president's asking you to fulfill his decrees, taking away your legislative authority. Is that the only way you can support your president, is to violate the Constitution? So this is what the purpose was here, to make sure that people would now see that there's no need to the national bank. But let's backtrack. What was the real purpose? As Burr intended, Van Buren, and the whole response to this nationalist period of development, in the with the Second National Bank. This was outlined in 4 tenets of Jackson's platform: to reduce the government to a simple machine, to 1, give away all the public land to certain people, no protectionism, explicitly he said, no internal improvements, and no national bank. Whereas the public funds before were protected from gambling with this special class of people Jackson talked about, now they would be available for gambling to whoever he wanted to give it to. All the people, the actual enterprises of the country, such as Matthew Carey's group in Pennsylvania and with manufacturers, we're not going to let them borrow money from the national bank. To shut down that machine of industry, you had to cut the ability for lending. To return to hard money. That's what Jackson wanted to do. And he was explicit about that. So it was the will of the president. That was the real way in which this operation was set into motion. And he wanted to promote the people who held land, the people who held slaves, put all the revenue of the government at his disposal. John Quincy Adams writes, forget the idea that appropriations of the public funds had to be made by law. Now they could be made with the stroke of a pen of this supple Secretary of Treasury. Millions of public funds transferred just by the diktat of the president, which is exactly what was done. Selecting certain banks, giving them this money at 0% interest, and granting them the profits that were made by these banks with the public funds. All right, so who was Tawney, the Secretary of Treasury for Jackson? Tawney was for the British in the War of 1812. Enough said. He converted to Jacksonism, and as stated, he became the 3rd treasurer for Secretary of Treasury for Jackson and the one who would do Jackson's bidding. Tawney later, after being appointed Supreme Court judge by Andrew Jackson, later in 1856 was the judge who ruled the Dred Scott decision that blacks shall never be citizens of the United States. That's Robert Tawney. Robert Tawney then later, while still Chief Justice in the Civil War, ordered the arrest of Lincoln's generals, Grant and other people, which was not carried out. You could basically call Tawney Jackson's Hole. So as John Quincy Adams wrote to his fellow legislators, you have to put this question up before you. Is the reason that the Secretary of Treasury given for removing these deposits a valid one? Was there a legal precedent? And that question was never fulfilled, never followed through by the Congress. And he writes, if you don't do this, the Bank of the United States may die, but its ghost will haunt this hall. Though justice should be denied Congress after Congress, perhaps from age to age, and your evasion of the question will be a standing recommendation of the claim till importunity shall extort from your successors the reparation sought in vain from you. And we stand now in a similar situation. This process, this takedown of the Second National Bank led to the whole collapse, the bank panic, and then essentially reverting to colonial status and a near destruction of the United States if Abraham Lincoln had not done what he did. So there are a lot of patriots out there who are supporting Ron Paul because they're angry at the Federal Reserve, rightfully so. But those people realize your alternative is not to return to hard money. What Jackson wanted to do was to return everything to hard money, no more banknotes, in contradiction to the entire intent of the founders of the United States. Even Madison at the Constitutional Convention said, we should not prohibit the United States from emitting bills of credit. This may be necessary at one time. We'll take out the clause, emit bills, from Article 1, Section 8, which it says, borrow money on the credit of the United States. The Articles of Confederation originally said to borrow and emit bills on the credit of the United States. But the power is implied, said Madison, and bills of credit and the creation of credit through a national banking system is entirely different than fiat money. What I'm presenting to you here, what Jackson did was in violation of the whole intent of the founders of the country to use the national banking system for credit for projects, to use a circulation of banknotes to ensure the use of a system of money as a means of that money is only a means of exchange for progress. Gold, silver, rocks, coal, you can make anything money. The issue is not gold or paper. The issue is how this national banking system is used for the promotion of the development of the country. What we have now with the Federal Reserve is a system which is not lending for industry. It's lending to other private banks to support a whole speculative bubble, to ensure the value of mortgage-backed securities, to make sure that there's enough liquidity in and out. It's making sure the money supply is sufficient for not industry, for private banks. The legacy of the United States is much different than you're being told, and this alternative is presented to you now. We want you, as a patriot, rightfully angry and seeing that your fate is being sealed with this blowout of the global monetary system with the Federal Reserve. But we want you as a patriot to look at this solution and join us now in promoting a restoration of the real American legacy, the national banking system, for a launching of reindustrialization, manufacturing, outlined in this report, NAWAPA 21. Thank you.